For the last decade, man-centered spaces on the internet have become dominated by an overarching philosophy that calls itself red pill. The idea of taking the red pill comes from the movie The Matrix and is seen as empowering by its adherents. They believe that they can now see outside the false matrix, the false reality built by women to hold men down and extract resources from them. As you can imagine, this has led to worries from feminists for the misogynistic conspiracies that emerge and the potentially violent actions they inspire and have inspired. On top of that, red pill is grounded firmly in a misinterpretation of evolutionary psychology that has legitimate evolutionary psychologists terrified and angry at what has become of their research. It seems like no matter who you are, if you're not red pill, you can only wonder in astonishment how such a malformed worldview could ever have gotten off the ground as much as it has and influenced as many men and women as much as it has. However, the discussion of worldview brings up the question, what exactly is the worldview of red pill? What do they believe and why exactly do they believe it? What are the consequences of these beliefs in the real world of their lives and their interactions with other people? Firstly, to understand what I mean by worldview, I'd like to use a simple definition from Coltco Rivera, where he defines worldview as sets of beliefs and assumptions. But he advises us to think of a worldview not as a description of reality, but as a lens through which one reads reality. The point is that our worldview shapes our view of reality and guides our actions in reality. The systems theorist Dr. Donella Meadows wrote that our worldview or paradigm can actually be the point of highest leverage when it comes to systemic change. If you change the worldview, the lens through which we see reality, everything else has the potential to organize itself and function in radically new ways. If we want to have a legitimate answer to the worldview of red pill, we must first understand the worldview that it offers. So in this essay, I hope to do just that. Part 1. Preliminary statements on the dynamics of worldview. Firstly, the point of this article is not to go deeply into the details of the evidence. I will obviously provide evidence as needed, but I'm trying to operate at a level of analysis above mere lists of evidence for or against minute details of what red pill says. Other people are already doing that, and I will reference their work throughout this piece and the other pieces in this series. Instead, what I intend to do here is to outline the red pill worldview using Taves and Asprom's worldview model, which I'll get to later in the video. The primary work I'll be discussing as evidence for the worldview of red pill is Rollo Tomassi's The Rational Male. There are a diversity of opinions within red pill itself, which is why I will be using other references as well. However, Rollo Tomassi is known within the community as the godfather of red pill. And at least in my experience, the Rational Male is considered a sort of Bible, you might say. So when I refer to something he has written, I will use his name. Otherwise, I will simply refer to red pill. Interestingly, I also think he personally represents one of the most important issues with red pill itself. Red pill is what Dr. Don Beck called a closed system. Someone with a closed system is unable to even recognize the barriers that keep them from seeing alternative views, and will actively fight to resist attempts to change them. Tomassi is a textbook case of a closed psychology. He treats open questions in evolutionary psychological research, or EvoPsych, as completely closed questions and decided answers, and then proceeds to build his worldview from there. The primary goal that I want to accomplish with this series is to show you the alternative answers to the questions that Tomassi and red pill take for granted. Alex of Date Psychology, for example, has a really damning article on Tomassi that criticizes him for just this. I highly recommend going to reference 3 to read his work, but he reports that when Tomassi was confronted by the fact that Evo psychologists disagree with his interpretations, He started going on about how there was a feminist conspiracy involving the US government and an anti-manosphere NGO. Rather than admit to the possibility that he was simply wrong, he'd rather come up with a grand conspiratorial narrative to explain why the actual researchers in the fields he used disagree with him. A quote from Nietzsche can help us understand why this happened. Gradually, it has become clear to me what every great philosophy so far has been, namely, the personal confession of its author and a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir. I have no idea what Tomasi's past might have been like, but it's clear that his philosophy is little more than a personal confession. Beyond the conspiratorial thinking already mentioned, he also believes in a gynocratic conspiracy, where the entire history of Western culture has been thrown off course by women since before feminism even began. He says here, in combination with their sexual agency and influence, they use male honor to position themselves in places where they can use indirect power. Cleopatra was an excellent example of this, sending armies to war by appealing to powerful men's pride and honor, while reserving her sexuality as a reward. Virtually every feminine social convention is rooted in appealing to or attacking male social institutions. End quote. I'm not saying that this doesn't happen to a certain extent. I think it would be foolish to say that women aren't going to find ways to covertly exert power and influence. When their overt power is taken away from them by patriarchal conventions, it simply would be surprising if they didn't. The point, however, is that he makes claims like this as if they are the absolute truth explaining everything women do. He also assumes a moral superiority for anything that can be classified as a male institution, which are usually just things he already agrees with. A lot of what he says is suspect, but very importantly, these claims are even more troubling precisely because he declares them as an absolute and then shouts conspiracy anytime he's challenged. Now, with all of that being said, I do try to be very accommodating with other perspectives. One of my guiding lights is the meta-modern ideal that the one who effectively integrates the most perspectives is the one who wins. In other words, we need to understand the perspectives of other people in order to effectively answer the worries and struggles they have. For example, understanding red pill well enough to be able to come up with better solutions to the problems it promises to solve. I noticed, however, that while I was reading Tomasi, I was being a bit overly critical. I tried to make an effort to identify points of agreement and question my knee-jerk disagreement. This book tested that perhaps more than any other book I've ever read. I should also say that I read this before in 2019, I believe, and agreed with it more than I do today, but even then, I found it so infused with resentment that he too often lost the plot. The best example of this is when he makes the claim that marriage puts all the risk on men and that women are utterly incapable of appreciating this fact. As such, any marriage that a man gets into must be on his terms completely. Firstly, the great irony of this claim is not only that it misses the very real risk of being fucking pregnant, but that Tomasi bases his worldview on the evo-psych idea of parental investment. We'll get into this later, but it basically says that reproduction is much higher risk on women, and that's why they prefer monogamous relationships. This might seem to lend evidence to Tomasi's idea that marriage is a gynocratic enterprise that seeks to steal the freedom and resources of men. Again, we'll get to that, but it's not as if marriage makes the risk of being pregnant go away. A woman still has to get pregnant, carry that baby to term, and then spend a significant time after pregnancy caring for the infant. However much a marriage may decrease the risk, that risk to life is still present, especially if the man wants her to get pregnant. He's putting that risk on her by getting married under the expectation that she will then get pregnant. And within Tomasi's worldview, he should have the right to demand she get pregnant as many times as his terms lay out. The risk doesn't just magically go away, and so directly contradicts the idea that marriage is, at the very least, only risk on men. The second point is that even if it were true that all risk was placed on men and none on women, the fact that the marriage is now purely defined by the power of the man places an enormous amount of risk on a woman. She is giving up all of her autonomy as a human being to this man she is marrying. That is incredibly risky. So, if marriage is now of immense risk to a woman and to the well-being of her offspring, which she might be forced to have, should that not mean that she should have a say in the terms of the marriage? By the time I had made it to that specific claim, I had pretty much lost any respect for Tomasi as a thinker. That is such an idiotic thing to say, and should tell you a huge amount about the personal confession that is the rational male and the quality of the worldview it creates. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but Jesus Christ, bro, come on. That's ridiculous. And yet, Nietzsche's quote applies to all of us, not just Tomasi. This series of essays on the worldview of Red Pill is just as much a personal confession about myself and my own worldview. As such, always keep that in mind regardless of who you're learning from, but including me. I'm going to be articulating my own worldview as I am criticizing Tomasi's. While I am going to be identifying my own explicitly in many cases, I want you to keep an eye out for the things that slip in that may not actually be true. I don't mean to say that I'm lying, but that I simply may be wrong and not realize it because of the limitations of my own worldview. So if one of Tomasi's biggest mistakes is having a closed worldview, then each of us must make the commitment to having an open worldview. For example, above I mentioned Tomasi's statements about feminine social conventions, and then immediately made a claim about patriarchal social conventions. Did you catch that? Who's to say who is the more conspiratorial thinker? Even though I think that patriarchy has explanatory value, we need to be aware of our own worldview and its limitations. This isn't to keep us from ever making any sort of claim with confidence, but to always keep our worldview open to update and change. So, to summarize what I've said so far, Tomasi has a closed worldview that uses gynocratic conspiracy as a means of protecting his worldview from collapse and change. Coltco Rivera writes about how catastrophic the collapse of a worldview can be, but also how transformative its collapse may be. We fight tooth and nail to defend against challenges, and yet those challenges may be the very thing that makes our worldview better. Tomasi's worldview needs to work better, even on its own terms. Another great irony is that Tomasi seems to view feminists as the worst stereotypes of them, that they are man-hating extremists who only care about their own interests as women. He completely misses the fact that his own worldview is like the mirror image of this radical stereotype. The reason I think this happens is because of what the philosopher Dr. Ellis calls reactive projection. This is the idea that when we realize we've been living in a fantasy, we have a reaction where we suddenly believe the complete absence of the fantasy. Tomasi writes about his own escape from the gynocratic conspiracy, realizing how all the fantasies he had about romantic love and patriarchy were complete bullshit. He then creates a worldview that is a mirror image of the worst representatives of feminism as a reactive projection. This robs women of almost every positive trait, leaving only the most negative, and creating something that is as fantastical as the most conspiratorial take on patriarchy. Again, he thinks marriage has no risk on women, and so men should be completely in control of women. So one question you may have at this point is, how do we make sure that our own worldview stays open? In previous essays, I've referred to the meta-ideological stance. I'll explain what that means in a moment, but as I've become more meta-ideological, I've begun to realize how arbitrary a worldview can really be. It's not absolutely arbitrary because some are better than others, which is the point of this essay. However, you can often say, okay, here's a goal I have, this is the ideology I agree with, and now I can get a result. But someone else can turn around and say, okay, I have the same goal, but this other ideology is the one I agree with, and now I can get roughly the same result. The meta-ideological point is that we can use sometimes very different ideologies to guide us and come to an outcome that is roughly the same. Like I said though, some ideologies are better than others. They're not arbitrary in the sense that the process of getting roughly the same result can fundamentally change the quality of the result. Two different ideologies can get you the same outcome, but the quality of that outcome can be very different depending on the ideology. So let's make that concrete. Let's say you desire to have sexual experiences. You're young, you're wild and free, and you just want to fuck. If you use one ideology, you might successfully sleep with many women, but the standards of the ideology itself makes those experiences really toxic and manipulative. You leave the women feeling used, and you learn that relationships with women are ultimately empty and void of any emotional connection. With another ideology though, you sleep with just as many women, but you have a lot of fun with women who leave feeling like they had a great time, and are even interested in seeing you again, even if it's just casual. And you learn that relationships with women can provide richly emotional and memorable experiences. With the meta-ideological perspective, you can compare and contrast the worldviews that make these differences possible. You're able to reflect on these ideological differences, play with the different ideologies, and come to higher qualities of even similar kinds of outcomes with women or in any other endeavor. So think about how powerful red pill ideology can sometimes be for a man who hasn't had any success with women whatsoever. You now believe this thing about the way males and females biologically are. You start getting laid way more than you used to, which must mean that belief is true. That kind of sounds like a scientific argument. You have a hypothesis about males and females, you run the experiment and successfully went from a loser who is afraid of women to a confident guy who is at the very least getting laid more. Therefore, the experiment led to positive results. Science. Again, do you see how powerful the red pill worldview can become for the men who decide to learn it? Obviously, if you're educated in the scientific process, you can probably see that he's potentially confusing correlation with causation. The new belief is correlated with better results, but it doesn't actually tell you if the new belief caused the new success. What if that new belief justified going out more than you did? It wasn't that the new belief caused better results, but it caused you to go out more and to feel more confident, which caused better results than staying at home and feeling unworthy. The biological belief had little, if anything, to do with it. The issue here is that just because adopting a worldview got you more results, doesn't mean you know why that worldview got you better results. Furthermore, it certainly doesn't mean you can generalize from I got better results to this entire worldview is now justified. Alex of Date Psychology says it best. Gurus need grand narratives. They need big results that explain the world around them in meaningful ways, but no single thing explains all that much about complex human behavior. End quote. Tomasi and Red Pill act as a guru, giving men an entire worldview that in some cases gets them better results, but that's then used to justify everything else about their worldview. By taking the meta-ideological stance instead, we keep ourselves open to update and are willing to challenge our own ideology or package of ideologies. We are then best able to make use of the worldview we do currently have. So with those preliminary statements out of the way, we can now begin constructing the worldview that Tomasi and Red Pill have. Part 2, the ontology of Red Pill. Returning then to the work of Taves and Asprams, they define a worldview as a collection of answers to the big questions of philosophy. ontology, axiology, praxeology, epistemology, and cosmology. I'll be using simpler terminology for the rest of these essays, but they use these words as follows. Number 1, ontology, our mental model or map of what exists. 2, axiology, what we value as good or bad. Number 3, praxeology, what actions should we actually take. Number 4, epistemology, how we know what is true. And finally, number 5, cosmology, where do we come from and where are we going? A really fascinating point about their model, especially in the context of EvoPsych, is that they say even a rat can have very simple answers, at least to the first 4 questions. A rat has a world model that includes predators to avoid, prey to eat, and shelter to hide in. That model also has an implicit axiology that states that predators are bad and prey and shelter are good. They have a praxeology that tells them how to actually avoid a predator or how to hunt the prey. And they have an epistemology, and that they learn about what is true through their nose and other senses. What separates humans from a rat is firstly that we can have a cosmology or narrative about our lives and futures, but we can also reflect on the questions themselves. A rat can only give implicit answers through their behavior, but a human being can say, oh, there are these 5 questions, I can come up with better answers to them, and those answers constitute my worldview. So, again, how do Tomasi and Red Pill actually answer these questions? Starting with their model of the world, as I've said, it's incredibly bound within a misinterpretation of evolutionary psychology. I think EvoPsych gets a bad rap, especially since Red Pill misappropriated it, but it's not a bad thing per se. Even if the entire body of knowledge that constitutes real EvoPsych turns out to be wrong, the kinds of questions they ask are still worthwhile asking. I'm not saying it is wrong either, but the issue is not the question, what does an evolutionary biological lens tell us about human psychology? That is a very reasonable question to ask, but the problem could be in the specific methods we use to answer that question. That doesn't mean that the question itself is a bad question. That would be like criticizing questions about disease because our knowledge of disease was created through a toilet paper microscope. Again, the entire body of knowledge would likely be wrong, but the questions about how do unseen forces relate to disease are still worthwhile. We just need a better microscope. So point being, evolutionary psychology is a worthwhile discipline, but we have to be aware of how we actually come to the answers to those questions. Additionally, we also have to be aware of the overarching worldview in which our interpretation of EvoPsych is embedded. This is one place where Tomasi really goes wrong. He conflates 3 very different ways of thinking about the influence of biology on our behavior as human beings: morality, determinism, and immutability. Beginning with morality, this is the famous distinction between is and ought, and is referenced in almost every book I've read on EvoPsych. People will often criticize EvoPsych for justifying the oppression of women by saying that females are more emotional and nurturing. Whether or not that's actually true is irrelevant to whether or not it ought to be that way. I think humans shouldn't get cancer, but the fact is that they do because of how our biology works. If males and females are different because of biology, it doesn't matter if that's a good or bad thing. It could simply be true. The second conflation, though, is with biological determinism. This is the idea that human behavior is the result of biological causes. Biology determines human behavior, personality, or even culture. I think this is true. Obviously, biology does influence who we are and how we operate in the world to a certain extent, but culture also matters. That then leads us to the third conflation, though, of biological immutability. It's one thing to say that biology is one force that determines our behavior, and an altogether different thing to say that biology's influence is immutable and cannot be changed. Tomasi sometimes conflates these 3 points and sometimes doesn't, really depending on whether or not he benefits. He does also believe in cultural determinism in the sense that cultural forces can determine how we think and what we desire. However, because he conflates biological determinism and biological immutability, he assumes that certain features of males and females that are in some way determined by biology cannot be changed. If we can say that females are on average more emotional and nurturing than males, then we cannot change that no matter what we do. This conflation then leads to a conflation with morality. Again, he doesn't always make this conflation. In fact, he'll say that we have to accept the harsh truths of biology because what is true biologically is not about morality. If something seems immoral, that sucks, but that's our biology. Like I said before, this is sometimes true. But he'll then conflate morality with the conflation that has already happened between determinism and immutability. Biology determines our behavior, we cannot change biology, therefore we ought to be how biology determines us to be. I hope you see how there are three different points being made here, but he's combined them all into one, especially when it serves his own interests about alpha male domination. You can also already see how his evo-psych model of the world influences values and what he tells men to do. By saying that men ought to do what their biology tells them to do, he is telling them to value a certain alpha male lifestyle and to do those things that make them an alpha male. However, it gets even deeper than that. Like I said, he believes that culture does have an influence on how we behave. However, he engages in a form of biological reductionism that I call gametic primacy. Biological reductionism basically says that all that matters is biology. We reduce everything to biology. Taken to the extreme, you'd literally believe that culture has no effect whatsoever and it's all biology. Again, Tomasi doesn't necessarily do that, but he does believe that biology is the primary causal factor when it comes to being human. I call his form of reductionism gametic primacy because he reduces the differences between the sexes to the differences between our gametes or reproductive cells. This brings us back to the idea of parental investment. The idea begins with the fact that male gametes or sperm are far smaller and do the fertilizing, whereas the female gametes or eggs are much larger and are fertilized. A male can bust a nut, fertilize an egg, and leave. A female is stuck with that fertilized egg for at least 9 months. This difference leads to different kinds of behaviors, preferences, and abilities between males and females. Tomasi built his entire worldview from the pillar of this difference between the gametes, and so whatever differences can be explained by this difference is given more causal power than anything else. Remember, I call this gametic primacy. Regardless of whatever other influences there are, be them from biology or culture, these gametic influences are going to be the most important. We see this most especially in his ideas about male and female sexual strategy. Throughout his book, he is constantly assuming that the only real sexual strategy is the one that is based on parental investment. A man's sexual strategy must be polygamous because his DNA is going to spread as far and wide as possible if he sleeps with as many women as possible. Women can't do this, and so her sexual strategy must be monogamous. And so any instance of monogamy at all is automatically assumed to be a female sexual strategy and forced on a man, taking away his freedom to practice the sexual strategy that he should be living. Again, notice the conflation here between determinism, biology has an influence, immutability, this cannot change, and morality, this ought to be what men and women should do. Ontology, the world model, feeds into axiology, what you value, which feeds into praxeology, what you must do, the actions you must take. All of this is made possible by the assumption of gametic primacy, that no matter how much culture may influence us, the differences between our gametes says something far more real about how we are as human beings. This all then leads to what I call the authentic desire fallacy. Think about the implications of gametic primacy. If the differences in gametes have the greatest causal power, which then causes our real strategy to be polygamous males and monogamous females, then that means that our most real, most authentic desire in life is determined only by our gametes. Part 3, the authentic desire fallacy. Tomasi says that if a man enters into a monogamous relationship, he is giving in to the feminine imperative, the pressures women place on men to make them conform to their female sexual strategy. The assumption is that if you as a man feel happy and satisfied in a monogamous relationship, that's merely because you've been successfully brainwashed by women to value monogamy. If you were able to throw off the social conditioning of the gynocratic conspiracy, then you'd realize that you could only ever be really happy if you became an alpha male who slept with as many women as you wanted. Of course, as a monogamous female, your wife would be most happy with a monogamous arrangement. And because a marriage must be completely on the man's terms, she would have to deal with the fact that she cannot sleep with anyone else and you can sleep with anyone else. Depending on who you listen to, a woman will either have to deal with this, or that is supposed to be the happiest arrangement for everyone involved. I'm sure some people would be. Like, my point isn't to criticize different relationship dynamics. It's to start to question whether or not the assumption of authentic desire is really as accurate or absolute as Tomasi claims. Number one, there's the assumption that we can only be happy as polygamous men and monogamous women. If you're a man who has given in to gynocratic monogamy, you can't really be happy. Your happiness is assumed to be a falsehood or delusion, or you're just an inferior beta male. It's not real. Does he mean that there is no happiness or that there are differing degrees of happiness? I don't know. However, the second point is to question whether or not this is really a meaningful assumption to make, or if it's just a fallacy, as I've been saying. How do we actually measure what is authentic? By the sheer pleasure? By the satisfaction it brings in various domains? Why exactly is it that the pleasure or satisfaction we experience as a consequence of gametic primacy is in any way more real or more authentic than the satisfaction we derive from achieving culturally determined goals? These are open questions. But remember, that's precisely one of the biggest criticisms I have of Tomasi and Red Pill. They treat this as a closed question and then build a worldview atop this potentially fallacious pillar. I'd like to give an extreme example from the work of Dr. Joe Court to demonstrate how malleable human sexuality can actually be. Before I get into that, I always have to preface this with the fact that he is an openly gay man, married to a man, he's on board with LGBT+, so please bear with me. He works with people who, because of sexual trauma that they experienced, have desires that defy their natural sexual orientation. For example, he's worked with lesbian women who are completely happy with being gay, and then, after having been sexually assaulted by men, they begin having violent erotic fantasies involving men. The same is true for straight men who've experienced child sexual trauma from men. They grow up to have a compulsive sexual experiences with other men, again, despite being straight. This all seems so crazy to most of us, but this is something that can happen based on experience, based on environment. It demonstrates very clearly that biologically determined facets of us that so many of us assume are completely immutable, such as our sexual orientation, are far more malleable than we think. This simply brings into question Tomasi's assumption of biological immutability, that what is biological cannot change. Now, Dr. Court says that this isn't a change in sexual or even romantic orientation, but a change in what he calls erotic orientation, in your behaviors, fantasies, and preferences given your experiences in life. For Dr. Court, sexual or romantic orientation is who you are at your core. People who've experienced sexual traumas compulsively reenact the trauma through sex that mimics the original trauma, until, of course, they resolve the trauma, and then their erotic orientation often returns back to normal given their sexual orientation. That all may seem like evidence for Tomasi's position that biology determines our authentic desire, and culture traumatizes us into liking things that aren't really authentic for us. From this perspective, gynocracy has traumatized men into preferring monogamy, and once they free themselves from this trauma, they'll become their natural polygamous alpha male selves. Their erotic orientation will return to what gametic primacy would have it be. However, this presupposes that we live in a gynocracy that has only traumatized men. The feminist Bell Hooks has written the exact opposite. She writes about how patriarchy has traumatized us, giving us a definition of sex as merely fucking. Men are conditioned to denigrate emotional connection and to view sex as an avenue for only pleasure and conquest. In an analysis of the red pill, Dr. Valkenburg reports that this is exactly what red pill advocates as a good thing. Here, he quotes the red pill subreddit Sidebar and how it distinguishes between natural, male, and female love. Quote, "The unconditional male concept of love is rebuked by women's, by necessity, fluid and utilitarian concept of love. The sidebar further counterposes the man's idealizations of unconditional love for the sake of love against the tactical and opportunistic concept of female love." End quote. Tomasi repeats the same ideas about men as the real romantics, and women as hypergamous manipulators who are always after the more alpha male. To be after the higher status alpha male is to be hypergamous. Women can't experience love in the way that men do, and in the way that men hope to receive from women. As such, a true alpha male must disabuse himself of his need for emotional connection, knowing that he won't be able to ever get it, and instead face the battleground of love in the form that evolution has actually made it. Again, quoting Dr. Valkenburg, "Women are attracted to strength, where strength is equated with the ability to ignore and suppress one's emotions. The subreddit finds a convenient framework for stripping intimacy from human relationships, such that commodified women no longer threaten any emotional boundaries established by masculinity." End quote. Red pill is obviously a particularly hyper-patriarchal masculinity. But understand that the influence of patriarchal standards is something that happens at a cultural scale across generations. One man being sexually assaulted as a kid could make him compulsively seek out traumatized sex with man after man after man, despite being straight, married to a woman, and the father of children. We have to be careful not to overgeneralize the extreme experiences of a small number of people. But the point I'm trying to make is that environment shapes desire. Think about how patriarchal social standards at a cross-civilizational scale influence both men and women, and what they desire and believe they should desire. In other words, how do we know what we consider natural desire is not merely environmental changes to erotic orientation brought about by patriarchal living standards? Again, EvoPsych is often criticized for justifying and perpetuating patriarchal standards. I'm not necessarily saying that's what all EvoPsych does, but it is without a doubt exactly what Red Pill does with EvoPsych, as Dr. Valkenburg very clearly laid out. In a later part of the series, I'm going to address the idea of patriarchal influence on desire more, but I think this punches a pretty significant hole through Tomasi's assumption that authentic desire is determined only by gametic differences between males and females. How much of what he claims males and females desire authentically is really just the effect of patriarchal trauma at a cross-civilizational scale? You might say that the patriarchal standards fit with the gametic differences we find, that patriarchy itself is merely a cultural manifestation of the biological differences we already see between males and females. Males are born to rule and females are born to follow. And so that's what we see in our culture. Patriarchy is simply nature. Firstly, it does seem to be the case that men are more interested in casual sex than women are. However, this doesn't mean women aren't interested in casual sex at all. Nor does it mean that they couldn't become more interested in casual sex in a culture in which punishment for female sexual autonomy was less extreme, and the rewards were as high as those for male sexual autonomy. It also doesn't mean that men aren't interested in monogamy. Alex of Datesite reports that the dominant mating pattern is serial monogamy, even in societies that practice polygamy. Secondly, however, none of this says in any way, shape, or form that polygamous behavior is the only authentic desire that a man could have. Again, beyond anything else we could criticize Tomasi for, his worldview is far too closed. Do differences in gametes influences what males and females tend to desire? Yeah, 100%, but it's not the only causal factor determining what we desire. And it certainly doesn't mean that this is the only thing determining what we really desire. I could literally stop right there and be done with it, but the real crux of the issue here is what is authentic desire really? Let's return to our extreme example of trauma-induced changes in erotic orientation. Dr. Quartz specifically warns against pathologizing abnormal sexuality. The false assumption we have is that anything deviant or abnormal or uncommon is in some way a negative thing. If you assume that your uncommon desires are in some way toxic, then you'll experience anxiety and shame anytime you experience those desires. That could literally be the only reason your desires become toxic. If you stopped shaming and judging yourself for having these desires, that could help you heal, breaking the cycle that leads you to, for example, compulsive sexual orientation defying adultery. The issue is that healing doesn't always lead to the desires going away. Dr. Court writes that sometimes, even though the trauma has been healed and the compulsions have gone away, a straight man may still desire to watch gay porn, for example. Again, this seems so weird and defies our typical understanding of sexual orientation, but that's why Court makes the distinction between erotic and sexual orientation. Given the evidence, it just seems that this particular person only has these desires because of sexual trauma they experienced. But even after healing, the desire doesn't go away. You may also have a gay woman who heals her trauma, but still desires sex with men. She's totally happy with her fantasies and perhaps even lives them out, even though they were caused by a traumatic experience. She's not attracted to the men necessarily, but she desires to have these experiences with men because of the entire context of the experience. Despite the negative place where this comes from, she still desires and is okay with her desire. Finally, you may also have someone who hasn't experienced any trauma, but has atypical sex just because it was available. This could be a person of any sexual orientation who effectively says, hey, fuck it, let's do it, and has sex with someone they typically wouldn't desire to have sex with. Even if the experience defies their natural, authentic orientation, they can still be satisfied and have a lot of fun doing this. Was this experience not authentic for them, even though they had a great time? For people who are so rigid with their sexuality, this just seems weird. And if that's your standard, that's fine. But to enforce that standard of sexuality on this person and call their experiences inauthentic or not real makes very little sense to me. My point in saying all of this is just to highlight how difficult it is to talk about authentic desire. If extreme trauma can lead to such intense violations of one's sexual orientation, but one is still perfectly happy living those trauma-induced desires, even after they feel healed, and it's no longer compulsive, then how can we call that inauthentic desire? The same is true for men who are allegedly brainwashed by gynocracy, or even women who are allegedly brainwashed by patriarchy. So here are a few orienting questions that may guide you to a definition for authentic desire. Number one, is it compulsive, or can you say no without undue distress? Number two, does it damage you or someone else? Number three, does it make you happy and satisfied, or empty and ashamed? And number four, does it disconnect you from the people and things you care about? This isn't a complete list by any means, but it can help you figure out if it's unhealthy. From there, it's mostly up to you. Even so, like I said, just because something makes you feel ashamed doesn't mean the thing itself is unhealthy or inauthentic. It could simply be that your culture has taught you to be ashamed of it. Unfortunately, if you try to connect that shame with evopsych, it can become very easy to perpetuate that shame as a biologically determined, immutable moral dogma. Tomasi's mistake is his conflation of determinism with immutability with morality. He grounds his worldview in biology being the most real influence on our lives, assuming that biology is unchanging and fixed, and then makes moral prescriptions for what people should do given that faulty reasoning. Now, you could say that a man's desires for other women simply prove all that I'm saying wrong. He really just desires to have non-monogamous sex. That's what's true for him. And yet, we desire all sorts of things all the time, and sometimes these are contradictory. I can desire weight loss so much that it's painful and still desire to eat a pizza. The fact that we can have contradictory desires doesn't mean that one is more real than the other, even if one could be rooted in an evolutionary argument. Both desires can be just as authentic. This mistake is a consequence of the ontology or world model that Tomasi has closed himself within. No matter what you say, if it can't in some way be related back to his misinterpretation of evopsych, he can just scream gynocratic conspiracy, brainwashing men. No matter how much you may say you're happy in your relationship and everything is going amazingly, he can just say, but that's contrary to your biology. On the other side though, if you were to criticize a man for doing something you find immoral or unfair or even straight up abusive, too bad, that's just how men and women biologically are. Dr. Garcia Favaro criticizes this exact dynamic in her paper Porn Trouble. She analyzed forums where women were looking for help in dealing with their boyfriend's porn use. She highlights how often evopsych is used to shame women into changing. Just as with Tomasi, the assumption is that male biology is immutable. He's simply hardwired to need more sex than women. One woman is given the advice, so the problem is you. Look for psychological help to be guided regarding the reality of life. Obviously, a man's biology cannot be changed. So, in effect, suck it up, princess, and grow up. Adapt yourself, change yourself, grow as a person, and just accept the fact that your boyfriend can't adapt, change, or grow as a person. Remember also when I said that it's a monogamous woman's responsibility to adapt to her polygamous man's desires to sleep with other women. These bad arguments would be much less likely from a world model in which culture was considered the primary influence, or even just as influential as biology. To be clear, it's totally fine if you want to watch porn or to sleep around with other women. But that certainly doesn't mean you are condemned to give in to those impulses like some biological automaton, nor that those are the only authentic desires you'll ever have. This is all the more ironic when we consider women being the one forced to adapt and grow to the man. And yet, women are also the emotional sex condemned to an irrational lack of agency. So much for the rational male. So, if that mistake is the consequence of Tomasi's world model, let's take a look at an alternative. Here's a picture of a world model created by Dr. Greg Henriquez. As you can see, he has life or biology emerging out of matter, mind emerging out of life, and culture emerging out of mind. One of his motivations for creating this model was precisely because conversations around human mind and behavior had become so convoluted and antagonistic. No one can agree on what's more real for the human being, or even whether or not certain academic disciplines are immoral or not. When it comes to who we are, according to Henriquez, we are the effect of real causal processes that are conceptualized by each part of that tree of knowledge system you can see here. Biology causes us, mind causes us, culture causes us, matter causes us. Saying that any has more reality or more authenticity is the consequence of a fragmented understanding of reality itself. Tomasi goes from that complex understanding of all the causal influences that Henriquez points out to something that looks more like this. Here, culture is contained within biology, and for whatever causal impact it has, it is always inferior and secondary to biology. On top of that, mind doesn't even make it into his model. This is because Tomasi adheres to an extreme version of behaviorism, and this limits his epistemology severely. However, this video is already my longest, and we have not even scratched the surface of Tomasi and Red Pill's worldview. In the next video, I'll tackle their epistemology. I'll also be summarizing everything I said here at the beginning of the next video, so definitely stick around for that. Until then, thank you so much for your time and attention. Please hit the like button and subscribe for more conversations on masculinity, psychological development, and the cultivation of a personal mythology. Thanks again, and all the best to you on whatever journey you find yourself on.